Welcome back, deep divers. Tonight we're taking a close look at the case of Mr. Travis Heinze.
Out of West Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
Right, exactly. We've got the transcripts, the official transcripts from the Zoom trial that happened back on March 4th, 2025.
Yeah.
And we're zeroing in, honing in on Judge Sanfelippo's rulings, and specifically his conviction and sentencing.
Yeah, that's what we're looking at tonight, the final pronouncements from the judge.
Exactly. So our mission tonight really is to sort of unpack the reasoning that the judge used based on the evidence that was presented in this trial.
Right.
And just as a little bit of a recap, the case originated from an after-hours encounter in a Target parking lot, and Mr. Heinze ended up with citations for prowling and loitering, as well as obstructing or hindering a police officer.
Right. 2 citations in total.
Exactly. And the trial itself, involved evidence from Mr. Heinze's own video, as well as testimony both from Mr. Heinze himself, who frequently invoked his Fifth Amendment rights, as well as from the former West Milwaukee police officer involved, Chief Jamie Ade.
Right. The primary players there.
Yeah. But tonight we're really kind of, like I said, laser focused on Judge Sanfelippo's final pronouncements.
Right. The conviction statement and then the sentence.
Exactly. So we're going to dig into that. What were the key things that he really emphasized that led him to these final decisions?
Well, after all the evidence and arguments have been presented, Judge Sanfelippo pretty much came right out and said the village had met its burden of proof for both citations.
Okay.
And he was very specific in noting that that standard was beyond a preponderance of the evidence, which is the standard for a civil case like these.
Okay, so clear finding then of guilt on both counts.
Correct.
So let's break them down, starting with the first one, that prowling loitering citation under Ordinance 5810A. What was it that stood out to you in the judge's explanation for the conviction on that?
Well, he cited directly from the ordinance itself. Explaining that it prohibits loitering in a manner that's not usual for law-abiding individuals.
Right.
Under circumstances that warrant alarm for the safety of persons or property.
Okay.
So there's kind of that twofold thing there. And he cited, a number of objective facts in Mr. Heinze's case. He was in a parking lot of closed businesses.
Right.
It was observed that he was there around 12:45 a.m., well after those businesses had been closed for the day.
And there were announcements and signage indicating the closure and that there was no overnight parking allowed.
Exactly. And the judge did address Mr. Heinze's claim that, he didn't understand the announcements. But Judge Sanfelippo really emphasized the objective reality of the situation. Like the signs were there, the announcements were made.
Right.
And he also made, I think, a really important point by contrasting Mr. Heinze's actions with others who were in the parking lot. Because Officer Ade did approach some other people.
Okay.
In the lot, and when he approached them, they left.
They applied.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So it seems that really factored into the judge's thinking in terms of, whether the circumstances warranted alarm.
So it wasn't just simply being there late, but it was the way that his actions differed from others, even though the indicators were clear that, the lot was closed.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. So let's move on now to the second conviction, obstructing and hindering an officer. What was it in the judge's decision on this one that was so important?
Well, he really focused on Mr. Heinze's repeated refusal to provide identification to Officer Ade.
Right.
And now, the judge did acknowledge that Mr. Heinze had a right to remain silent in this civil proceeding, which is a right he invoked multiple times, by the way.
Right, citing the Fifth Amendment.
Exactly. But then Judge Sanfelippo drew a key distinction here. He said, in a civil case like this, an adverse inference can be drawn from silence.
Okay.
Unlike a criminal case.
Interesting. So while he had the right not to speak, the judge was allowed to consider that silence in a negative light when he was making his ruling or verdict.
That's exactly right.
In this civil case.
Yeah.
So that's a really important distinction there, I think, for our listeners to be aware of, isn't it?
It really is. I mean, this is a point we've covered before on the show, but it's worth repeating.
Yeah.
Because it's, it's a subtle distinction, but it's an important one.
Yeah.
And the judge explicitly stated that by not identifying himself, Mr. Heinze was hindering Officer Ade's ability to conduct a legitimate investigation.
Okay.
He reasoned that without that identification, Officer Ade couldn't properly assess the situation, like, check for outstanding warrants, just figure out, why is this guy here in a closed parking lot?
Right.
And in the judge's view, this refusal really impeded the officer's ability to do his job, which fits the definition of obstruction.
So the judge viewed it as not an exercise of a right in this particular context,
Right.
but rather an actual action
Right.
that interfered with his ability to do his job.
Interesting. Okay. So following these convictions then, Judge Sanfelippo moved on to sentencing.
Yes.
What kind of penalties was Mr. Heinze facing here?
Well, for that first citation, that prowling and loitering citation, which was officially identified as 91 ADRC 71-B, the judge ordered Mr. Heinze to pay a forfeiture of $169.
Okay.
And then for the obstructing and hindering an officer citation, that's 91 ADRC 71-C, the forfeiture was set at $263.
Okay. So separate financial penalties then.
Yes.
For each of those citations. Any other financial obligations that were involved here?
Yeah. So on top of those forfeitures, which totaled $432, Judge Sanfelippo also ordered Mr. Heinze to cover the court costs that were associated with the trial.
Okay.
Which amounted to $164.
Okay.
Bringing the total amount due to $596.
And a deadline for all of that was also specified, right?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That's an important part. Judge Sanfelippo specified that the full amount, the $596, was due by 4:00 p.m. on April 4th, 2025.
Okay.
And really importantly, he also laid out potential consequences if Mr. Heinze failed to meet that deadline.
And what were those?
Well, he was very explicit. He said if he didn't pay the $596 by that date, it could result in a suspension of his driving privileges.
Wow.
So, yeah. Adds a real tangible consequence.
Definitely a significant, consequence there.
Right, beyond just the monetary fine.
Exactly. So we've gone through the judge's reasoning for the guilty verdicts on both counts, and then the specifics of his sentencing. Now, for you, the listener, what are some key things that we can really take away from this deep dive into this particular trial and its conclusion?
Well, I think, even though this case might seem to be about, relatively minor late-night parking lot situation, I think it really highlights some of the complexities of interacting with law enforcement. The judge's emphasis on objective facts.
Right.
Observable things like the closed businesses.
The signs. Right.
Versus relying on an individual's, statement that they didn't understand something.
Their interpretation.
Right. I think that's a key point. And I think it underscores how the law often looks at what a reasonable person would understand in a situation.
Yeah. And I think the comparison that the judge drew, too, between Mr. Heinze's response and the response of the other people in the parking lot.
Yes.
It kind of emphasizes how, the context and how your actions are interpreted during an encounter with law enforcement. It really matters.
Yeah.
That it suggests that even, seemingly passive behavior can be seen through this lens of potential concern.
Right.
And then, of course, that decision of the judge to draw that adverse inference from his silence in this civil context.
Yeah, that was huge.
That really was a really crucial aspect to all of this. It reminds us that while we have the right to remain silent, which is a bedrock principle of our legal system, its implications could be really different depending on the setting.
Right.
Like whether it's a civil or criminal case.
Yeah.
In a civil case, that silence can actually be held against you in a way that it's not in a criminal proceeding.
It's a good thing to keep in mind.
It is. So it really emphasizes, I think, the importance of understanding not just your rights, but how those rights can be applied and interpreted in different situations.
Right.
And I think this case, though it was very specific, like you said, to parking and the refusal to identify oneself, it does touch on that larger issue of the balance between individual rights and the responsibility of law enforcement to maintain order.
Right.
And to investigate potential issues